di tengah-tengah kita di sini di upper room untuk acara kita yang sudah kita tidak asing lagi dan kita nantikan, yaitu Karen Armstrong Public Lecture. Dan Frizi, acara ini adalah merupakan rangkaian dari ulang tahun ke-30 tahun Mizan. Kita bisa berikan tepuk tangan untuk Mizan.
30 tahun dan kita juga sudah menantikan lama untuk kedatangan Karen Armstrong di Indonesia. Kalau sedikit informasi dari teman-teman Mizan, penantian kita lebih dari 10 tahun. Sudah baru bisa mendatangkan Karen Armstrong.
Ya, it took 10 years to convince Karen Armstrong to be here dan pastinya kita semua yang ada di sini sudah sangat ingin menantikan dan juga mengetahui isi pikiran dan penyampaian langsung dari Karen Armstrong. Dan pastinya Bapak dan Ibu, kedatangan Karen Armstrong di sini bukan hanya untuk memperkenalkan buku yang terbarunya, ya, adalah juga dalam rangka beliau set up atau menyebarkan sebuah movement.
Betul.
Yang bernama Charter
for Compassion.
Ya. Dan seperti apa gerakan tersebut dan movement tersebut yang sudah pastinya mendunia, kita akan lihat TVC yang berikut ini.
Kind of aggressive religiosity, sometimes called fundamentalism, has grown up in every single one of the major world traditions as a rebellion against this imbalanced world, a rebellion against humiliation, powerlessness.
Religion has focused more and more on a narrow understanding of religious dogma.
And there's a sense of rage expressed in religious terms.
Every religion, as I understand them, has a history of intolerance, and every religion has principles for overcoming intolerance.
I want people to hear the compassionate voice of religion. I want to change the conversation and bring compassion to the forefront of people's attention. And we need to somehow find a way to implement the golden rule globally so that we treat other nations, other peoples, whoever they may be, as we would wish to be treated ourselves. We need a charter for our own souls, for our own sake, but also for the sake of the world, the sake of our perilously divided world, which is, in one sense, drawn together more closely than ever before.
Semua agama, apapun nama agama itu, dari manapun berasalnya, itu semua mengajarkan prinsip perdamaian, keamanan, dan cinta kasih.
Bahwa Islam turun ke bumi ini sebagai rahmatan lil alamin, rahmat bagi semesta alam. Artinya adalah bahwa Islam mengajarkan kita untuk berlaku lemah lembut, untuk berlaku ramah, untuk berlaku baik kepada siapapun, tidak hanya kepada sesama agama maupun kepada orang-orang yang berbeda agama.
Agama kita disebut dinur rahmah, dan Nabi Agung kita, Nabi Muhammad SAW disebut Nabiur Rahmah.
Agar perdamaian terwujud di dunia ini, cobalah untuk saling mengerti, saling berbagi, dan saling menghormati.
Perdamaian itu ketika ada rasa toleransi, rasa saling menghargai, rasa saling menghormati.
Hidup damai aja, nggak ada kekerasan, nggak ada saling ejek.
Ya, Frizi, pastinya kita sudah menantikan ya lecture-nya dari Karen dan juga nanti akan ada QA. Tetapi bukan hanya itu saja ya acara kita malam hari ini ya.
Tentu ada beberapa testimoni yang akan kita ikuti dan akan disampaikan oleh sejumlah tokoh yang tentunya sangat mumpuni untuk menyampaikan ini. Antara lain kita akan mendengarkan pengantar lecture dari Bapak Komarudin Hidayat selaku tokoh agama dan juga akademisi. Dan juga, ya betul, silakan kita berikan
Selamat
Tepuk
datang Pak
tangan
Omar.
yang meriah kepada Bapak Komarudin yang juga sudah hadir bersama-sama dengan kita. Kemudian juga kita akan mendengarkan pengantar lecture dari Ibu Yani Wahid yang baru saja tiba di tengah-tengah kita nih.
Selamat malam Mbak Yeni.
Selaku aktivis Islam, politisi dan sebagai Ketua Wahid Institute.
Dan pastinya adalah sobat analis ada Romo Frans Magni Suseno. Selamat malam. Romo yang sudah pastinya tidak asing lagi. Dan Bapak dan Ibu sebelum kita mulai acara, terutama nanti pas Karen sudah ada di atas panggung, ada beberapa hal yang pasti yang kita sampaikan karena kondisinya Karen yang sudah tidak begitu baik. Beliau meminta beberapa hal, yang pertama adalah apabila Anda ingin memotret, mohon tidak memakai flash. Dan juga nanti ketika kita akan ada sesi Q&A, mohon ditulis terlebih dahulu dan dipaparkan nanti di acara Q&A.
Dan yang pastinya singkat, padat, supaya kita bisa memberikan kesempatan kepada sebanyak-banyaknya kita yang hadir di sini untuk berkesempatan memberikan pertanyaan langsung kepada Karen begitu ya.
Pastinya kita mau belajar compassionate juga ya untuk malam hari ini. Baiklah, untuk yang pertama kita akan mendengarkan siapa Frizi?
Pengantar lecture dari Bapak Komarudin Hidayat. Beliau pejabat sebagai Rektor Universitas Islam Negeri Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta untuk periode 2006-2010. Dan Pak Komar ini meraih doktor di bidang filsafat barat di Middle East Technical University, Ankara, Turki.
Sekali lagi kita berikan tepuk tangan untuk Bapak Komarudin Hidayat. Kami persilakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Satu kehormatan dan kebahagiaan bagi saya untuk tampil di sini. Dan sekalian saya ingin gunakan waktu ini sepadat mungkin. Pertama tentu saya menyampaikan apresiasi, terima kasih kepada kawan-kawan dari Mizan untuk menghadirkan Karen Armstrong. Sudah lama ya, saya sendiri termasuk salah seorang kolektor dari karya-karya beliau. Bagi saya dia termasuk the living legend ya, pemikir keagamaan, sosial, yang berkaitan dengan agama. Kalau saya amati ya perjalanan hidup Karen Armstrong ini, pertama adalah dia bermula dari pendekatan teologis doktrinal terhadap agama. Dia dibesarkan sebagai biarawati, yang kemudian berkembang lagi dia curiosity dia dalam bidang keilmuan masuk pada ranah sejarah. Dia mengadakan survei studi perbandingan agama secara historis dan buku-bukunya sangat monumental. Misalnya The History of God, bagaimana research survei di Timur Tengah sebagai pusat agama sekaligus pusat konflik, dan bagi dia itu mendapatkan satu wilayah riset yang menggairahkan sekali, luar biasa. Jadi ketika riset menulis itu terasa getarannya, sangat antusias, luar biasa. Nah dari situ setelah mendapatkan satu data-data lapangan, dia meningkat lagi pada refleksi filosofis dari apa yang dia temukan. Dan kalau saya membaca buku-bukunya itu terasa sekali perjalanannya itu. Dari kajian historis, kemudian empiris, filosofis. Dan terakhir saya amati kemudian dia naik lagi pada tataran spiritual. Nah namun spiritual bagi Karen Armstrong bukan spiritualitas yang kemudian terpisahkan dari realitas sehari-hari, tapi dia memberikan satu analisis ilmiah historis, tapi sekaligus juga vibrasi spiritualnya terasa sekali. Makanya Karen Armstrong saya yakin buku-bukunya sangat bisa dinikmati oleh siapa saja, bagi the seeker of the truth, lintas agama, lintas negara, lintas bangsa, karena yang dia sajikan itu menyentuh satu, kalau kita bicara sejarah agama-agama besar dunia, ini tentu yang diraih itu banyak sekali. Kalau bicara Yahudi, Nasrani, Kristen, Hindu, Buddha, ini kan berarti menjangkau sekian pikiran hati penduduk dunia ini. Dan kemudian dia masuk pada tataran filosofis, sofistik bagaimana pencarian kebenaran. Lagi-lagi membaca buku Karen Armstrong, ini saya merasa tidak aja sebuah journey yang begitu intens, yang begitu dalam, yang kadang-kadang saya merasa nggak sanggup untuk mengikuti. Gitu. Jadi kalau dalam bahasa puisi Mi'raj Rasulullah itu ketika Jibril naik sayap itu kemudian nggak sanggup ngikuti sayapnya terbakar, tentu tidak dalam konteks jauh itu, tapi yang saya rasakan saya ketika membaca buku-buku Armstrong itu kadang-kadang terasa saya berhenti dulu. Mengapa? Karena nampak sekali antusiasme dan alat intelektual dia begitu dalam, dan dia juga kelihatannya selalu menemukan hal yang baru. Makanya kalau ketemu karya Armstrong ini, begitu ditanya dikit saja itu laksana ensiklopedi, wah itu bisa keluar panjang lebar gitu. Sangat mengasihkan, dan saya yakin ya yang ada di benak beliau ini kalau saja ditulis itu akan menghasilkan lembar-lembar berjilid-jilid buku lagi, saya yakin, karena tidak pernah berhenti. Dia ini seorang pembelajar yang tidak pernah berhenti, tapi sekaligus juga seorang pengajar. Jadi mencari dan berbagi, terus mengalir pikiran-pikiran dia. Nah kemudian dari sisi komunikasi relasi antara agama di dunia dan di Indonesia, hemat saya umat beragama dari manapun datangnya sangat beruntung dan terima kasih terhadap sosok Karen Armstrong. Karena dia datang kemudian menjembatani secara intelektual, dia bisa menjelaskan umat Islam Indonesia misalnya harus terima kasih pada Armstrong. Karena lewat tangan dia, pikiran dia nulis buku tentang Muhammad misalnya, yang belum tentu umat Islam itu bisa nulis sebagus itu. Atau sebaliknya, orang yang beriman itu biasanya kalau nulis yang menonjol semangatnya, gitu kan. Tapi kurang ditopang oleh analisis data-data ilmiah historisnya, gitu kan. Nah sebaliknya Armstrong ini nulis dengan dukungan data-data ilmiah historis, tapi sentuhan spirit vibrasi, spiritualitasnya itu terasa sekali. Oleh karena itu pantas terima kasih bagi masyarakat Barat atau Timur, Islam non-Muslim, Kristen, Yahudi, terima kasih pada karya Armstrong. Karena ketika umat yang lain itu terlibat heboh, konflik, sampai berdarah-darah, tapi ada sosok karya Armstrong, itu kemudian dengan tekun, teliti, akurat, jernih menyajikan peta itu. Sehingga bagi kawan-kawan yang melihat berbagai hiruk pikuk hubungan antara agama, sangat terbantu ketika membaca karya-karya Armstrong. Untuk konteks Indonesia ini sangat relevan. Oleh karena itu udah sekalian sekali lagi hemat saya kehadiran perjumpaan kita dengan karya Armstrong kali ini, di antara kita yang belum akrab dengan buku-bukunya, mungkin ini akan menjadi satu pemicu untuk mendalami lebih dalam. Karena betapapun bahwa pikiran yang disampaikan oleh seorang penulis itu hanya sebagian kecil saja dari pikiran yang pernah dituliskan dalam buku-bukunya. Namun demikian, ketemu orangnya langsung itu juga punya makna yang sangat spesial, sangat khas dibanding seseorang pernah membaca bukunya yang berjilid-jilid. Nah lebih lengkap lagi kalau kita pernah dua-duanya, dengan pengarangnya pernah ketemu langsung sehingga ada sentuhan langsung, di sisi lain kemudian kita dalami lagi karya-karyanya. Sekian dari saya sekedar sebagai suatu apresiasi, dan kepada Mizan saya sendiri secara pribadi sangat mendukung adanya satu gerakan Islamic Compassionate Islamic Movement, jadi gerakan Islam kasih sayang. Sekian literatur saya baca, dari Ibn Arabi dikatakan bahwa alasan pertama Tuhan menciptakan semesta dan manusianya itu apa? Karena cinta, gitu. Jadi karena cintalah alam ini diciptakan, karena cinta Tuhan manusia diciptakan, dan karena cinta Tuhan maka universe ini bertahan. Dan pada dasarnya hubungan yang sangat primer Tuhan dan manusia itu karena cinta. Hanya ketika cinta itu kadang-kadang kecewa dan sebagainya, maka menimbulkan deviasi. Ada kecewaan, ada kemudian kebencian dan sebagainya. Tapi pada dasarnya the very basic of human nature itu sungguhnya cinta kasih. Yang dalam bahasa agama disebut fitrah. Fitrah manusia itu satu, orientasinya pasti apa? Senang pada kebenaran, pada kebaikan, pada keindahan, pada kedamaian. Oleh karena itu apa yang tidak benar, tidak baik, tidak indah, dan tidak datang damai, pasti hati kita ini risih gitu. Why? Because it against our nature, because it's against our fitrah. Karena fitrah kita itu pada dasarnya dicipta dan tercipta karena cinta kasih. Sehingga apapun yang merusak, mengganggu hubungan cinta kasih, pasti kita ini akan gelisah rasanya. Dan itulah dalam Islam mengapa Tuhan punya 99 nama. Itu pun simbolik sekali. Karena 9 itu angka omega, 99 double omega, artinya unlimited name of God, gitu kan. Nah, dari sekian unlimited name attribute of God itu, Tuhan paling seneng pintunya, diketuknya itu apa? Pintu Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, yaitu kasih sayang. Dan orang beragama tidak terhitung berapa kali sehari mengucapkan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Nah, dalam Islam, oleh karena itu secara sangat simbolik, ketika kita audien dengan Tuhan, audien pada Tuhan, kita mulai dengan Allahu Akbar. Allah yang maha agung, yang lain kecil semuanya. Namun demikian, setelah audien dengan Tuhan Maha Agung, bukannya turun kemudian dengan kesombongan, tidak. Tapi apa? Dia harus berbagi oleh-oleh berupa apa? Dengan kasih sayang, yaitu salam. Sehingga ketika sholat, diawali dengan Allah Akbar dan ditutup dengan salam. Salam itu pun apa? Tengok kanan, tengok kiri. Artinya apa? Orang yang selalu audien pada Tuhan, orang yang merasa beriman pada Tuhan, orang selalu berislam pada Tuhan, maka mestinya orang itu menjadi instrumen penyebar kasih sayang buat semuanya. Dan itu disimbolkan tiap hari bagi orang mukmin, yaitu dalam bentuk adegan sholat. Allah Akbar dan kemudian Assalamualaikum. Makanya kalau ada orang ngaku beragama, tapi kemudian keberagamaannya mendatangkan keresahan, ketakutan, hemat saya ada yang salah dalam software dia dalam beragama. Sekian, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Bapak Marin Hidayat atas lecture dan juga refleksinya ya terhadap karya-karya dari Karen.
Selanjutnya kita akan mengikuti pengantar lecture dari Ibu Yeni Wahid.
Ya, Ibu Yeni Wahid adalah seorang aktivis Islam dan politisi Indonesia dan juga pernah menjadi koresponden bagi The Sydney Morning Herald dan juga The Age Melbourne. Dan tulisannya pasca referendum dari Timur Timur dia dianugerahi Walkie Award. Dan beliau juga adalah menempuh master degree di Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Dan sekarang pastinya aktif menjadi direktur Wahid Institute. Kita akan dengarkan paparan dan juga refleksinya terhadap karya-karya Karen. Kita sambut Bapak dan Ibu, Bu Yeni Wahid.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua, selamat malam. Yang saya hormati, tapi belum tampak di sini sepertinya Ibu Karen Armstrong. Walaupun beliau belum ada di tengah-tengah kita, saya hanya ingin menyampaikan bahwa it's a great privilege to be here and hope to be finally meeting you later. Karena Ibu Karen Armstrong ini such a legend, terutama tentang karya-karya yang berhubungan dengan Abrahamic religion. Jadi saya sendiri juga harap-harap cemas mau ketemu. Jadi malam ini saya akan menjadi seorang groupie kira-kira. Dan para tokoh-tokoh yang hadir pada hari ini, Pak Komarudin Hidayat, yang telah mengiluminasi kita dengan pengantar beliau tadi. Sambungan semalam saya sudah mendengar dari Pak Komar tentang ceramah tentang kematian. Di acara 6 hari tahlilannya Pak Taufik Kemas di kediaman Ibu Megawati Soekarno Putri. Luar biasa sekali dan saya sangat senang sekali mendengar ada lanjutannya lagi malam ini Pak Komar. Romo Magnis, sosok yang sangat pemberani sekali. Saya ingin kita semua memberikan aplaus kepada Romo Magnis. Saya rasa tidak perlu saya jelaskan konteksnya apa, kenapa kita harus memberikan aplaus kepada beliau, pasti sudah paham semua kira-kira. Para hadirin hadirat sekalian yang tidak bisa saya sebutkan satu persatu. Pertama-tama saya ingin menyampaikan selamat ulang tahun kepada penerbit Mizan yang berapa ya? Saya rasa sudah akil balik lah yang penting ya. Jadi sudah sangat bisa mempertanggungjawabkan apa yang dicetak dan diterbitkannya, kira-kira begitulah. Kita hari ini akan mendengarkan apa yang dikatakan oleh oleh Ibu Karen Armstrong mengenai banyak hal. Ibu Karen Armstrong itu mungkin banyak kata yang bisa mendefinisikan beliau, tapi buat saya ada dua kata yang menyeruak ya setelah membaca banyak hal, terutama tentang latar belakang beliau. Kata pertama adalah beliau seorang believer, seorang yang percaya akan adanya divine power, kekuatan yang besar yang ada di dunia ini. Yang kedua, beliau adalah seorang yang gelisah, seorang yang restless. Jadi seorang yang percaya tetapi yang gelisah. Karena apa yang dipercayainya sekarang seolah-olah menjadi sumber konflik di dunia. Agama bukan lagi menjadi jawaban, bukan lagi menjadi sumber inspirasi, tetapi seolah-olah dianggap sebagai sumber konflik, bahkan menjadi penyebab banyak aksi-aksi kekerasan. Berangkat dari kegelisahan tersebut, beliau mengembara melalui pengembaraan intelektual, menelurkan berbagai macam karya, dan kemudian ujung-ujungnya mengajak kita semua untuk kembali kepada sebuah konsep yang kedengarannya sangat sederhana sekali, compassion. Compassion, kasih sayang, rahmat, peri kemanusiaan. Sebuah konsep yang sangat simpel sekali tetapi mengamalkannya luar biasa susahnya. Nah jadi saya tadi dibisikin sama suami saya, Bu Karen itu tingkatannya kalau dalam Islam sudah zuhud. Karena sudah melampaui, kalau tingkatan intelektualitas sudah diselesaikan, buku-buku karyanya History of God, terus tentang fundamentalism, semuanya hubungannya sama histori, filosofi sudah selesai. Sekarang ini ada satu yang tetap tidak terjawab setelah menyelesaikan semua karya-karya tersebut. Jadi kalau syariat selesai sudah. Kalau Islam kan ada tingkatan Pak Komar. Tingkatan ketaatan seseorang. Yang paling banyak yang tingkatannya syariah masih syariat ya. Sembayangnya 5 waktu, paling rajin ke masjid, puasanya luar biasa, puasa wajib, puasa sunat, semua puasa dilakukan. Tingkatannya syariat masih. Lalu setelah itu naik ke tingkatan makrifat. Sudah dekat dengan Tuhan. Tidak terlalu peduli apa yang dikatakan oleh manusia lain, yang penting kedekatannya secara spiritual dengan Sang Ilahi. Nah yang ketiga ini yang paling banyak lagi sebetulnya di masyarakat kita. Di atas syariat, makrifat, yang terakhir malah maksiat. Nah kalau Bu Karen keliru, jadi bukan keliru tapi terbalik, justru beliau sudah mencapai tingkat zuhud ya, tingkat sudah di atas makrifat tadi. Nah, compassion yang ingin diajak oleh Bu Karen untuk kita bagi bersama-sama melalui Charter of Compassion ditandatangani oleh begitu banyak tokoh-tokoh dunia, sebetulnya bukan barang baru kalau di Indonesia. Dalam masyarakat kita yang namanya compassion itu dalam pandangan agama kita, minimal kalau saya dalam berangkat dari kultur Jawa, ya, compassion itu sesuatu yang sudah sangat mengakar. Ya, agama dalam kultur masyarakat Jawa bukan sekedar sesuatu yang sifatnya rasional, tidak bisa dipahami dalam hanya tataran kognitif atau logos saja. Tetapi justru sesuatu yang dihayati, diamalkan, diajarkan, dan diselami dalam hati. Karena itulah dalam filsafat Jawa yang namanya agama itu agomo, ageming aji. Agama itu adalah busana yang sangat berharga. Agama yang menuntun perilaku kita. Tidak penting Al-Fatihahnya teteh atau tidak, bagus atau tidak bacanya. Tetapi kalau dia bisa mengamalkan, maka dia sudah menjadi orang yang sangat beragama. Nah, jadi tapi walaupun ini sudah ada dalam masyarakat kita, memang perlu terus dibangkitkan. Ya. Bu Sono tadi itu, ya. prinsip-prinsip ajaran agama sebagai sebuah hal yang menerangi bagaimana cara kita bersikap dengan masyarakat lain. Karena agama, sayangnya sekarang masyarakat ini banyak terpaku agama semata pada ritual saja, ibadah mahdohnya saja, ibadah-ibadah ya seperti tuntunan sholatnya, tuntunan berdoanya seperti apa, lafalnya bagaimana bagus atau tidak, tapi prinsip-prinsip kasih sayangnya cenderung dilupakan. Kalau kita hanya bertumpu, hanya mengacu, hanya fokus pada bungkus agama, banyak sekali persoalan-persoalan di masyarakat yang tidak akan bisa kita jawab. Pernah ada seorang ulama mengatakan bahwa jawaban dari persoalan TKW yang disiksa dan diperkosa di luar negeri, di Arab, salah satunya adalah bahwa TKW itu perempuan, itu kalau pergi ke sana harus didampingi muhrimnya. Nah, ini kan sangat jauh dari realita. Untuk bisa mengirim dirinya sendiri, dia harus jual sapinya, dia harus jual sawahnya, dia bayar ke calo, dia harus hutang ke tetangganya, dibayar 5 tahun lagi. Bagaimana mau bawa suaminya? Bagaimana mau bawa kakak laki-lakinya? Nah, ini kan akhirnya kemudian menjauhkan agama dari realita. Orang jauh dari agama karena dianggap agama bukan lagi sebagai solusi. Banyak sekali persoalan-persoalan yang ada di masyarakat, realita yang ada di masyarakat, kalau dijawab dari kacamata agama, buntu kita semua. Dan hanya bisa dijawab melalui kacamata compassion. Saya mau cerita, pernah ada seorang waria mendatangi Pak RT. Dan bertanya, kebetulan ada pemakaman, ini setelah pemakamannya Pak Taufik Kemas. Dia kemudian mendatangi Pak RT tempatnya dan bertanya, Pak RT, kalau laki-laki meninggalkan namanya almarhum? Iya, kata Pak RT. Lah kalau perempuan almarhumah? Iya. Lah kalau saya ini apa Pak Haji? Ayo. Kalau dia apa? Pak RT-nya diam. Terus kemudian berpikir, saya tahu kata Pak RT-nya. Apa Pak RT? Kalau kamu itu aluminium katanya. Lalu si waria itu marah dan berkata kepada Pak RT, Pak RT saya ini banci bukan panci. Itu, jadi saya rasa joke tadi itu sudah mensamarikan atau menyimpulkan bahwa kalau kita lagi-lagi hanya berkaca menggunakan agama secara letterlek, secara literalis, maka akan banyak sekali orang-orang yang justru lari dari agama. Ya justru kemudian malah tidak mengakui Tuhan. Saat ini malah ada si Aan Alexander, divonis 2 tahun penjara. Di penjara di Sijungjung sana karena dia ateis. Sudah 1 tahun di penjara. Apakah dia bertobat dan kemudian mengakui bahwa Tuhan ada? Tidak ada. Saya memakai kata bertobat saja pun itu dari kacamata saya. Justru Aan mungkin berpikir kamu yang harus bertobat ya gitu. Kebalik ya mungkin ya, persepsinya berbeda. Namun artinya bahwa yang namanya keyakinan tidak bisa kita paksakan. Dan kacamata agama tidak bisa menjawab banyak hal dalam masyarakat kita. Kacamata compassion, kacamata kasih sayang, kacamata rahmat, itulah yang harus menjadi penuntun kita ke depan dalam mengarungi kehidupan yang makin kompleks ini. Saya rasa itu yang bisa saya bagi sedikit dan sekali lagi saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih juga kepada penerbit Mizan atas kesempatan yang sangat berharga ini dan kepada Ibu Karen Armstrong. Looking forward to hear from you directly. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Ibu Yeni Wahid secara umum dan secara pribadi karena saya juga tadinya mau aplaus buat Romo tapi sudah didahului jadi diwakilkan gitu. Terima kasih.
Iya. Dan kebetulan sekali ini setelah ini kita akan mendengarkan pengantar lecture dari Romo Franz Magnesius Heno, tokoh Katolik budaya Indonesia begitu ya, yang juga adalah guru besar filsafat sosial pada Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat di Driyarkara, Jakarta. Dan sekaligus beliau adalah Direktur Program Pasca Sarjana Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat Driyarkara.
Bapak Ibu, tanpa berlama lagi kita akan persilakan kepada Romo Frans Magni Suseno. Kami persilakan.
Dear friends, Misan, dear Karen Armstrong, I'm not sure whether Karen Armstrong is hearing what we are saying, or probably not, so I will go on talking in Indonesian. But I want to say in English, I am very happy that Karen Armstrong comes here. She is really one of the great people of our times. She helps us religious people, to go back to what is the real heart of our belief, to love, to compassion. Sekarang saya mau mengucapkan selamat kepada Mizan, Profesiat Mizan. Kita juga sangat happy bahwa ada Mizan di sini, dan saya kira itu sumbangan bagi kita semua dan bagi bangsa Indonesia. Semoga terus maju dan berkembang. Mengapa tadi saya mengatakan Karen Armstrong itu orang besar dalam pandangan saya? Dia kan juga mengalami perjalanan hidup. Dan kesan saya ya seperti tadi sudah dikatakan Mbak Yeni, Pak Komar. Dia mungkin kaget kok antara agama begitu banyak yang tidak baik, kekerasan, kebencian dan sebagainya yang seharusnya tidak ada di sekitar agama-agama. Dan Karen Armstrong tidak hanya macam berkhotbah kepada kami, kepada kita, melainkan dia memang mengangkat apa yang ada di dalam agama-agama. Dan saya kira kita semua melihat bahwa love and compassion, kasih dan rasa belas kasihan, kesediaan untuk ikut menderita dan memaafkan menjadi hati dari agama. Karena Armstrong pernah menulis dalam buku History of God, jangan kita memalukan Tuhan. Jadi jangan kita mengatasnamakan Tuhan dalam suatu kelakuan yang sudah jelas menyangkal nilai-nilai kemanusiaan yang sebetulnya dihayati setiap orang yang masih normal, biasa di dalam hatinya. Kasih, belas kasih dan barangkali juga kerendahan hati. Itulah yang dituntut dari kita orang beragama. Bagaimana kita bisa bicara tentang Tuhan kalau tidak rendah hati. Rendah hati karena melihat betapa kita di dalam agama kita, dalam keagamaan kita, di dalam mungkin kepintaran kita tentang agama, karena banyak di antara kita ini pinter tentang agama kita. Kalau kita tidak sadar betapa tidak memadai dengan Tuhan, betapa kita kurang Dan karena itu kita rendah hati. Karena Armstrong itu mengajak melihat yang mempersatukan, karena itu memang ada di dalam agama-agama sendiri, tidak perlu dari luar, tetapi agama kembali kepada hakikatnya. Alangkah baiknya kalau agama memang menjadi rahmat bagi semua, kalau semua orang entah beragama atau tidak beragama merasa aman, merasa didukung, merasa disemangati kalau ketemu dengan orang-orang beragama, daripada kita menjadi takut atau kita menjadi tertekan atau sebagainya. Dari Karen Armstrong, ya saya belajar bahwa kita pertama-tama perlu saling menghormati di dalam kekasan masing-masing. Tidak mungkin menerima orang lain kalau kita memaksakan pikiran kita, keyakinan kita kepada dia. Terimalah dia dalam keutuhannya, hormatilah haknya untuk hidup sesuai dengan keyakinannya, juga untuk beribadat sesuai dengan keyakinannya, juga kalau kita tidak sependapat, kalau kita berbeda pendapat, karena ada Tuhan di atas, dan kepada Tuhan kita serahkan bagaimana akhirnya kita semua dinilai. Dear Karen Armstrong, thank you that you have come. Thank you for your work. For many, many years, you helped us to find our identity as religious people, make us humble, realizing how we fail in love and compassion. I also wish you, hopefully you can hear it, that you will be in good health and a long time with us and feel the blessing of God. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Romo Franz. Ya, kita sudah mendengarkan banyak sekali lecture dan juga refleksi tentang Karen Armstrong dan juga karya-karyanya ya.
Betul, dan senang sekali malam hari ini Karen Armstrong sudah berada bersama-sama kita.
Yeah.
Jadi kita akan sambut Karen Armstrong.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Karen Armstrong.
Kita berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah. Well, we are honored and delighted to have her with us tonight. So help to give a very warm welcome to the one and only Karen Armstrong.
Ya, namun visi sebelum kita mendengarkan lecture dari Karen Armstrong sendiri, kita pastinya akan mendengarkan kata sambutan warm welcome pastinya ya dari Direktur Utama Mizan dan juga pakar filsafat Islam dan Tasawuf. Bapak dan Ibu, kita akan sambut Bapak Haidar Bagir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera buat Bapak Ibu sekalian. Perkenankan saya bicara 10 menit terpaksa dalam bahasa Inggris supaya juga bisa dipahami oleh Ibu Karen Armstrong. First of all, let me here again express our gratitude to Ibu Karen Armstrong. Ibu in Indonesian language means mother. So We have Mother Teresa, now we have Mother Karen Armstrong. For her willingness to come and visit us here in Jakarta, to share her invaluable views on the positive role of religion in these difficult times in the career of human beings on earth. I would also like to thank all of our guests who are present here tonight for participating in this important event, an event that hopefully would revitalize our belief in the role of religion as a source of compassion, and through this principle, a source of peace and happiness for the humankind. Terima kasih banyak Bapak-bapak dan Ibu-ibu sekalian. Now, I would ask you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind permission for me to deliver a very short remarks on the compassionate aspect that is the central aspect of the teaching of Islam. Jadi saya ingin, karena Mizani dikenal sebagai sebuah penerbit Islam, saya ingin menggunakan sedikit kesempatan ini untuk berbicara tentang compassionate aspect agama Islam yang sudah banyak dilupakan. Let me open this by quoting the late Professor Annex in one of his lectures at Harvard University in 2002, and I was very lucky, I was sekolah. Ya, satu kali katanya, I was teaching in Ankara at the Faculty of Islamic Theology. I was at great pain to explain to my students the theories of Rudolf Otto about aspects of God, the numinous as the mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans. Tuhan sebagai zat yang agung, dahsyat, menggentarkan, dan aspek Tuhan yang indah, cantik, membuat orang terpesona. When one of my students got up and said, "Professor, this is very simple," kata mahasiswa Turki itu. "We have had this in Islam for centuries and centuries. We have always spoken about God's Jalal, His tremendous majesty, and His Jamal, His fascinating beauty." In fact, itu kutipan Profesor Schemmel sampai di situ. That's the end of quotation from Professor Schemmel. In fact, we find that in the Quran, God reveals Himself through the names that belong to the group of His fascinating, beautiful qualities, Jamal tadi, in verses numbering 5 times as much as the number of verses in which He, or I should say she, reveals herself through her tremendous majestic qualities atau Jalal. Jadi di dalam Al-Quran itu ada 5 kali lebih banyak ayat di mana Tuhan menampilkan dirinya dalam aspek keindahan, kecantikan yang mempesona, ketimbang dalam aspek kebesaran, kedahsyatan yang menggentarkan. Also in the same line, His vengeful quality, di dalam Al-Quran disebut Duntiqom atau Al-Muntaqim, appears only once, while the opposite quality, the forgiving, Al-Ghafur, Al-Ghaffar, recurs about 100 times. Jadi 1 kali Tuhan itu disebut namanya sebagai pembalas, tapi sebagai pemaaf ada 100 ayat di mana Dia menyebut dirinya sebagai the forgiving. Islam, in the context of the aforementioned, is essentially a religion of mercy, of love, a single and encompassing love that manifests in God's love for man, man's love for God, and man's love for man and the entire creation. Love is indeed universal basis as well as the goal of Islam, like in all genuinely spiritual religions. This understanding of Islam has been mainly echoed by the mystics of Islam, the Sufis of all age. Ini di dalam tasawuf umumnya. Quoting a famous phenomenologist of religion, Van der Leeuw, Professor Schemmel further reveals the prevalent mistake that has been made by the scholars and laymen alike in grouping Islam into the nomos or law-oriented religion. Actually, scholars would almost naturally group this religion, Islam, together with Judaism in this manner, instead of grouping this religion, Islam, as the eros or love-oriented religion together with Christianity. Biasanya para fenomenolog kalau mau bicara Islam, Islam itu agama hukum bersama agama Yahudi, berbeda dengan agama Nasrani yang dimasukkan sebagai eros atau love-oriented religion. Ya. In fact, all religions, Judaism not excluded, also Islam, should be understood as love-oriented, should one's understanding not be limited to its exoteric aspect only. The Quran begins by calling him God, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Tadi Profesor Komarudin Hidayat sudah mengatakan, generally translated in English as the most beneficent and the most merciful. But the word Rahmah in Arabic, from which both these words are derived, has a very comprehensive connotation comprising love, mercy, blessing, and many other cognate meanings. In this principle of love, the entire faith of Islam and its way of life were summed up or are summed up. Salah satunya in one of the verses God will say, verily, those who believe and do good works, the beneficent will appoint for them love. Ar-Rahman akan memberikan kepada mereka wood. Jadi yang maha pengasih akan memberikan kepada orang-orang yang beramal baik rasa cinta. Di dalam in another verse God will say about himself, and he is the forgiving and the loving. Still in another verse God says of himself, ask pardon of your Lord and then turn unto him repentant. Verily my Lord is merciful, loving. In fact, love is the quintessential principle of God. He emphasizes this in the Quran, that my mercy encompasses everything. Rahmati wasi'at kulla syai'. Tidak ada satupun, apapun hal, benda yang tidak diliputi oleh kasih sayang Tuhan. Sangat kategoris. Rahmati wasi'at kulla syai'. My mercy encompasses everything, kata Tuhan. Ya. While again, Tuhan berkata, God says, surely my Lord is the most beneficent, the most merciful. Further, in several hadith, several prophetic tradition narrated by many narrators, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, God reveals unequivocally that my mercy dominates my wrath. Rahmati sabaqat ghadabi. Kasih sayangku menaklukkan murkaku. Murkanya Tuhan itu adalah bagian dari kasih sayangnya Tuhan. Unfortunately, the understanding of some of the masses within the followers of Islam itself and many outside observers too would be fixated towards the exoteric or legal formal aspect of religion, to the majestic aspect of God, as well as the legal formalistic role of the prophet. But as the Swedish Lutheran bishop Tor Andrei, a leading Islamologist, wrote in his biography of Prophet Muhammad, a religious faith, according to Tor Andrei, a religious faith has the same right as every other spiritual movement to be judged according to what it really intends and not according to how human weakness and contemptibleness have stained this ideal. In conclusion, ini bagian terakhir, in conclusion, what a Muslim needs to do is to refresh his or her understanding of religion, Islam, by always bearing in mind that religion is not just legal matters, but is principally a matter of nurturing love within ourselves, love towards everything, towards all members of the universe without exception. Indeed, Muslims are taught to inculcate within themselves the traits of God, Nabi mengatakan takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah. Berakhlaklah kamu dengan akhlaknya Tuhan. Dan akhlaknya Tuhan, if we sum up all the trait of God, it's beneficent and merciful. Jadi setiap orang beragama harus menanamkan rasa kasih sayang di dalam dirinya. God above everything is the most loving, the most merciful, and the most beneficent towards His creations. Therefore, we have to be loving and compassionate towards our fellow creations. Moreover, Muslims are taught to follow the example of the loving and compassionate Prophet, about whom God says as the best example, owing to the fact that he indeed possesses a lofty character. Wa innaka la'ala khuluqin azim. Prophet in turn has taught his followers that the love of God can only be achieved through the love towards fellow humans. Prophet says, if you love what is on earth, you will be loved by who is in heaven. Barang siapa mencintai yang di bumi, maka dia akan dicintai oleh yang di langit. This is the true meaning of Islam as a mercy to the universe. Seperti yang dikatakan oleh para pembicara tadi, rahmatan lil alamin. That the followers of this religion have to understand and embrace. And for this, we establish Mizan, memprakarsai dengan dukungan para tokoh-tokoh Muslim, termasuk Profesor Komarudin Hidayat, Profesor Romo Magni Suseno, dan tentu kita berharap Mbak Yani Wahid juga. We establish the Compassionate Islam Movement, gerakan Islam cinta. Cinta tapi digabungkan dengan gerakan. Biasanya cinta itu lembut, tapi kita ingin gerakan. Kita ingin menimbulkan militansi para pencinta. Jadi biasanya orang pembenci itu militan, pencinta itu lemah lembut, akhirnya kalah sama pembenci. Jadi kita mau tampilkan militansi para pencinta dengan gerakan Islam cinta. This we establish as a means to revitalize this aspect of Islam, as well as to reconsolidate religious-minded followers of this religion to participate in ushering once again a new dawn of religion as the main source of compassion among peoples of the world. Again, thank you very much Ibu Karen Armstrong. Thank you for you all. Terima kasih banyak yang hadir. Selamat menikmati pencerahan dari Ibu Karen Armstrong. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Bapak Haidar Bagir yang adalah Direktur Utama Mizan dan pakar filsafat Islam dan tasawuf. Dan Vizi, langsung saja kita masuk ke dalam acara utamanya ya.
Public lecture dari Karen Armstrong.
Yeah, Karen Armstrong is one of the leading scholar and commentator within religious affair or spiritual giant, as Pak Gede Prama said yesterday. She spent 7 years become a Catholic nun in 1960s, but left her teaching order in 1969 to study English at Oxford. And in 1982, she became a full-time writer and broadcaster. She's a best-selling author in 22 books and still counting, including The Spiral Staircase, a memoir of her spiritual awakening after leaving the convent, and books about Christianity and Judaism, the Buddha, Islam, myth, the case of God, the history of God, to name a few.
Yes. And she is also a passionate campaigner for religion and liberty and the founder of the Charter for Compassion. So we are honored and delighted to have her with us tonight. So please welcome the one and only
Karen Armstrong. Kami juga mengundang Bapak Haidar Bagir untuk naik ke atas panggung untuk bersama-sama dengan kita sebagai chairman dan moderator nanti di acara dan Q&A. Kami persilakan.
Smaller person. Thank you very much for your wonderful welcome, and what a lot there are of you. I know Mizan have been trying to get me here for many years, and I'm delighted and honored to be with you here tonight. Thank you for inviting me. Well, you probably know, in 2008, I heard that I'd won a prize. every year in those days, TED, TED Talks, give prizes for people whom they think have made a difference in the world, but who, with their help, could make more of an impact. And they give you a wish for a better world. And I knew almost immediately what it was that I wanted, because it's long been a source of frustration to me that religion, which should be making a major contribution to one of the chief tasks of our time, is often seen as part of the problem. Because surely one of our greatest duties in this time is to create a global community where people of all ethnicities and all ideologies can live together in peace and mutual respect. And if we don't achieve that, I don't think we will have a viable world. I go around sometimes giving a lecture called Compassion, a Nice Idea, or an Urgent Global Imperative. And I think there is an urgency here. So and yet, very often when religious people come together, I'm sure this doesn't happen in Indonesia, but you don't hear much about compassion. You hear a lot of bishops get together, they're talking about some doctrine or condemning something, but you are not hearing this word, which is what we are needing in this time. Because in my study of religion, I have discovered that every single one of the major world faiths, and of course all religion, has at its heart the ethic of compassion. Every one of them has developed their own version of what's often called the golden rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And it said that this, not belief in a certain doctrine or a certain practice, but this is the test of true spirituality. One of my favorite golden rule stories comes from Hillel, Pharisee, the older contemporary of Jesus. And it's said that one day a pagan came to Hillel and said to him that he would convert to Judaism if Hillel could recite the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being." That is the Torah, and everything else is only commentary. Now, go and learn it, he says. And that's a very deliberately provocative and audacious statement. Many of the things that we associate with Judaism, like the creation of the world in 6 days, the exodus from Egypt, the promised land, this is all just a gloss, a commentary on the golden rule. And then Hillel, as is common practice among the rabbis, at the end of his interpretation of scripture, he gives a call, a mikra, a call for action. Go and learn it. You go now and read it. You read the scripture and make everything a commentary on the golden rule. And it seems to me, it's been clear to me, that it's not enough for us to practice this ethic in our private lives, though that is very important too. Because now it seems to me that unless we learn to implement the golden rule globally, so that we treat all peoples, whoever they are, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world is going to be a very unsafe place. If this had been done before, and I speak as a British woman my country has a long history of colonialism, if we had treated the colonized peoples as we would wish to be treated, then I don't think we'd be having so many political problems today. But somehow we have to rescue the situation. And so I asked TED to help me create and craft and propagate a charter for compassion, and it was composed by activists and thinkers representing 6 of the major world faiths: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And it was a demonstration that on this we were all in agreement, at a time when the religions are often thought to be chronically at odds with one another. On this we could all agree, and we could reach across the divide and work together for a better world. And perhaps in question time, I shall tell you some of the things that we've been doing with the Charter, and I've been wonderfully excited to find what so much is going on here. When I go back to London and get in touch with my colleagues in the United States, I shall be so happy to tell them. And I entirely agree about your idea about Bali being an island of compassion. I could hardly... I was so excited about it, I didn't sleep last night. But now my brief today is to just see how the world religions, one way and another, have expressed this ethic. And one of the very first people to formulate the Golden Rule in a form that was actually written down was Confucius, for whom I have a real affection, because Confucius is so easy. He's not so daunting as some of these sages, going off into the desert or into the wilderness and fasting. He liked a good meal, a song, a glass of wine, and his way is simple, because his disciples asked him, Master, which of your teachings can we put into practice all day and every day? And what's the central thread that runs through all your teachings and holds them all together? And Confucius said, Shu, which means likening to the self. Use your own feelings, he said, as a guide to your treatment of others. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. That's the central thread, he said. That's all I'm teaching. And notice, he says, all day and every day. In England, when we've done something nice for somebody, we often have a habit of saying, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though we could then return for the next 23 hours to our usual selfishness and greed and unkindness. No, all day and every day. Why is this so important? Because you leave yourself behind. The Greeks had a word which has slightly been vulgarized in English, ecstasy, ekstasis, which doesn't mean necessarily going off into some kind of trance, though it can mean that. It means stepping outside, ekstasis, standing outside the self. And all the great sages and prophets have told us that it is selfishness. It's our egotism that holds us back from enlightenment, from the divine. And if you are dethroning yourself from the center of your world and putting another there constantly in the Golden Rule, then you are laying ego aside. One of his disciples, his favorite and most talented disciple, describes beautifully the experience of living with, as he says, ren, which Confucius always said refused to translate it, but later Confucians would call it benevolence or compassion, because he said it's humanity. This is simply how human beings should behave. And you leave that self behind and you have an ecstatic experience. But it goes all day and every day. It's not just is part of your ordinary life. You're constantly straining ahead, said Yanhui, towards the ineffable. But not with any great mortifications or feats of meditation, but simply by putting other people first. And his disciples said, Master, how can we apply this to political life? Because the Confucians were very political. And they were living in, as all these sages were, in a violent and terrifying time when society seemed to be crumbling. Indeed, it was crumbling. The old China was crumbling over a period of 200 years called the period of warring states. And the sages all said, look, we will destroy each other if we continue with this violence. The only ethic is the golden rule. No prince would invade somebody else's territory if he practiced the golden rule, because he would not like his own state to be invaded. And so how do you apply it to political life? And here, I think this is so simple for how to do it. Confucius says, you seek to establish yourself, then seek to establish others. You want to turn your merits to account, then make it clear, enable other people to turn their merits to account. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself, a central political maxim. And when you go among the common people, he said, behave as if you are in the presence of an important guest. Now, this is the maxim. I mean, have we in the past, I mean, I say as a Western person, seeking to establish ourselves, also sought to establish others? No, we've often impoverished and exploited. This cannot go on. So when people say you've got to keep politics and religion separate, this is humanity. This is the only way to move forward. Now, Muhammad, I don't need to, blessed peace be upon him, but you have given such a beautiful exposition, I feel de trop, but he was also writing and working and prophesying at a time of violence. Tribal violence in 7th century Arabia had reached an unprecedented crescendo. And it looked as though they were going to tear each other apart. And in Mecca itself, that too was torn apart. An infant capitalist economy was burgeoning, and some people were going to the wall in the stampede for wealth. And the Quran is nothing but, from start to finish, a cry for compassion. And what is the bedrock message of the Quran is not a doctrine, but simply to care for the vulnerable people of society, to share your wealth fairly, and to do the acts of justice day by day, hour by hour. Originally, the religion seems to have been known as tazakah, which can be translated refinement, but that by the process of living in a community, in an ummah, in which you are constantly striving to make things more fair and more just for everybody, demands that you go beyond the ego. And by doing that, day by day, hour by hour, over a lifetime, the ego goes. And you stand before God in a state which the Sufis would call fana. The ego is extinguished, and then you get a larger enlightened self, Baka. And the word Rahman, it's related etymologically, I believe, to the word for womb. And that raises the whole issue of mother love. And the icon of the mother and the child is something that everybody loves. It represents us at our best. But mother love is also very hard. A mother has to get up every single night to her crying child, no matter how exhausted she is. She has to put her own wants and needs and desires to one side and watch that child at every second of the day, taking total responsibility for him. If he hurts himself, she has to be there and to answer his every need. And then that cute little baby grows up and can become a horrible disappointment. But the mother doesn't give up. The mother will always be with the child. Now, I think this links up very nicely. There's an early Buddhist prayer, I believe attributed to the Buddha himself, which says, "Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child." That we have to have that sense of absolute responsibility for all creatures, all human beings, whoever they are. And because all these faiths insist that you cannot confine your compassion to your own cozy little group or your own congenial friends. You have to have what one of the Chinese sages called concern for everybody. Love your enemy, said Jesus. Reach out to all tribes and nations. And the Confucians would say that you begin your quest when you're a child, in the family. That's when you learn to relate to people. It can set you up for life or knock you down for life. But you learn, and the rules of courtesy in ancient China gave everybody in the family a measure of absolute respect. And Confucius had the insight to see that when you behave towards somebody with absolute respect, they feel it. They feel themselves empowered by that. They feel that they are worthy of respect, that they are in fact sacred in the sense of precious and absolutely inviolable. Now, in Buddhism, the whole idea of compassion is linked to this responsible action. It means that you must take responsibility for the pain in the world. This pain is something that all human beings share. All of us, no matter how fortunate and privileged we may be, suffer pain. And we will all die. And it won't be pleasant. And so pain, often it divides us because we feel that our pain is so special that we hug it to ourselves, and sometimes we even use our pain to pay back, or we think the world owes us something. But this is to lock yourself into pain. And the Buddha says you must go out to the world, not hug your enlightenment to yourself or your religion to yourself and getting a warm glow, but reach out. There are two stories that I think emblematic of how this works in Buddhism. They're called myths. Now, in modern English, the word myth comes to mean something that isn't true. But that's a product, that's an interpretation of our rational age. Previously, a myth was something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time. It's talking about timeless truth, the hidden meaning of things, and most emphatically, it's a call to action. It's a program for action. And a myth doesn't come to life for you unless you put it into practice. That's why a lot of people who say they've got to believe in a whole lot of doctrines without practicing the faith find themselves at an impasse. Now, these myths of the Buddha are telling each Buddhist what he or she must do to achieve his or her own enlightenment. And the first is the story of his going forth and becoming a monk. It's said that when the Buddha was born, his father held a celebration and asked the local priests, to tell the child's fortune. And one of the priests predicted that this child will be a Buddha, an enlightened man, and he will see 4 very disturbing things, 4 disturbing sights. And as a result of that, he will go forth and become a monk, join the renouncers, and seek enlightenment and find a way for all human beings to attain enlightenment. Well, this career option didn't satisfy the Buddha's father, who had more ambitious plans for his son. So he shut the child up in a palace and surrounded the grounds with guards so that no disturbing sight could come anywhere near this child. And the Buddha existed in this weird state for 29 years until the gods finally said, this is ridiculous, and sent 4 of their own number disguised as a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a monk. And these disturbing sights to a young man who'd never seen any suffering before, so struck him that he left home that very night to seek a cure for the pain of the world. And this is what you're going forth to heal pain as well as to achieve your enlightenment, and the two are one. But Buddhism is a very psychological religion, and I think that image of the grounds guarded is a wonderful image of the mind in denial. We all want to think that suffering happens out there, far away, that it doesn't touch us. We want to keep it at bay. And so we hold it at bay and think suffering has nothing to do with us. And the pain of the world has nothing to do with me and my privileged little enclave. But suffering will always break in. And if you allow it to break in and to break your heart, then you are on the road to enlightenment. And the story then goes on that the Buddha eventually achieved enlightenment, of course, and afterwards he was sitting under his Bodhi tree and thought, well, this is nice. And the thought occurred to him that perhaps he should teach his method. And he thought, no, I don't want to do that. It's going to be far too depressing because people don't really want to give up their egos. I'm just going to sit here. And at this point, Brahma, the highest of the gods, gave a terrible cry. From his highest heaven, he came down to earth and knelt. The god kneels before the enlightened man, and he says, Lord, please preach your teaching, your method, because the world is lost if you don't. The world will be utterly lost. And he said, look at the world. And the Buddha, it says, looked at the world with an eye of a Buddha, which is not someone impervious, but he sees with the compassionate eye, and he sees a world in pain. And for the next 40 years, the Buddha tramped the roads of India with his monks, trying to teach them a way of dealing with their pain. And that idea that enlightenment, sometimes people just want to hug their religion to themselves. It's very prevalent in the West at the moment with New Age and stuff, that you get a nice warm glow, and you don't want to sort of mess up with other people. And we even have that, and you don't want to sort of mess up with other people. And we even have that a little bit in the compassion movement. I was asked to say, what is a compassionate city? And I said, an uncomfortable city. Because it's a city that sees pain and is disturbed by it. And there were people who didn't like that at all. They were hoping compassion would make everything lovely. And it will certainly improve matters, but there must be that grain of discomfort, that little grain of discomfort, because it's like the grain of sand in the oyster that creates the pearl, that irritant that creates the precious pearl. Now, I'm finishing now I wrote a book called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And you won't know anything about this in Indonesia, you Muslims, but there's a program in the West for alcoholics. And they wean themselves away from their addiction by this 12-step method, which people who've done it say is a really spiritual experience. It means coming to yourself and going out to others, and it has to go very deep. And I did it quite deliberately, do it in 12 steps, because I think we're addicted to our pet hates. We don't know what we do without them. I mean, sometimes I see mutinous expressions crossing people's faces, saying, gosh, can't I ever again say something unpleasant about my ex-wife, or my boss, or that country with whom we're at war. And we depend upon our enemies sometimes for our sense of self. They are everything we're not. And often we meditate on the awfulness of our, we're supposed to be meditating on holy things, but we meditate on their awfulness. And it gives us a feeling of righteousness. No, that's not the way to go. And I'm just going to quote Jesus here. I haven't mentioned Christianity yet much. And Jesus said, love your enemies. Now, some people scratch their heads, and the word love in English and England and the West is often very debased, you know. Oh, I love that movie. Didn't you? I love ice cream, etc. And or else people just think it's continually an emotion. Compassion is not an emotion necessarily. Emotions come and go. They depend very much on the state of your digestion or how much sleep you had last night. And we know how ephemeral they are. Sometimes you can be filled with anger to the people who are closest to you in the world, and yet you still love them. Jesus was not talking about that kind of love. He was doing a bit of rabbinic midrash interpretation of the Bible, which looks at the Hebrew Bible and then takes it on a bit further. So he's commenting on the Hebrew, love your neighbor. And Jesus saying, yes, love your neighbor, but also love your enemy. Take it a bit further. Now, the word love in the Hebrew Bible is hesed. And that was a term, a legal term, used in international treaties. It meant loyalty. And two kings who may have been enemies before would promise to love each other, which didn't mean they would fall into each other's arms ecstatically, but that they would look out for one another, give one another practical help, come to their aid in time of trouble. They'd be good allies, responsible allies, even if this meant a short-term loss for themselves. And this is the kind of love we must have for our so-called enemies if we want a viable world. Now, I'm going to finish, this perhaps rather surprisingly, with the Greeks. Because we don't often think of the Greeks as religious, but of course they were. All people are religious. And at the height of their great rational Renaissance in the 5th century BCE, they devised a new genre, the genre of tragic drama. It was a competition. There was also a religious festival. Every year on the feast of Dionysus, god of transformation, the whole of Athens would come to the theater to watch a series of plays that were tragic plays that showed a human being in an agony, going through some man or woman in an extremity of pain. And usually these myths recast, the story recast one of the ancient Greek myths in the light of something that was preoccupying Athens that year, so that it was a commentary. This was a festival that everybody had to attend. They even let prisoners out of jail to see this. It was a civic duty and a civic meditation when you meditate on the plight of your city, what it's going through, what its problems are this time. And what tragedy did was put suffering on stage instead of pushing it away behind those array of guards that we put up around ourselves. You put it on stage and you'd see this human being suffering. And periodically the leader of the chorus would turn to the audience and say, now weep. Weep for a man like Oedipus, who had broken every taboo in the book. Or weep for Heracles, a man who'd been driven mad by a goddess, and in this frenzy, God-inspired frenzy, had killed his wife and children. People who seem utterly polluted and whom you'd avoid in ordinary life. Weep for them. And the Greeks did weep. They weren't like Western men who just sort of gulp and wipe an embarrassed tear from the corner of their eye. They wept aloud because they believed that weeping together created a bond between human beings. Because they felt that they were no longer alone in their pain. The pain was there and they could share it. And they had extended their sympathies. They had moved out of their comfort zone and embraced someone like Oedipus or Heracles. Now, the very first of these tragedies to come down to us is Aeschylus's The Persians. And it was written some 7 years after the Battle of Salamis, a landmark naval battle which the Greeks won. But before they won, before they achieved this victory, the Persian army had rampaged through Athens, burned, looted, destroyed, tore down houses, and then went up to the Acropolis and tore down all the brand new beautiful temples there. And now, 7 years later, Aeschylus is saying, weep for the Persians. There's not a hint of triumph, not a hint of gloating. This is one of the first contacts we have between East and West. And he said, the Persians are treated with absolute respect. And Xerxes, the defeated hero of the Battle of Salamis, comes home from the war, and he's escorted with great sympathy into his palace. The Persians are presented as a people in mourning. And it was a risky thing to do because people felt very strongly about this war, and previous plays that had tried to deal with it were booed off the stage. This was not, and it was preserved. And what I often say in the West, especially in the United States, is, could you put on a play in Broadway that looked at 9/11 and the Iraq War and the aftermath from the point of view of the Muslim world, and weep for them? And that is a spiritual exercise. Now, I'm finishing this whole idea about pain and the acknowledgement of one another's pain and the pain of our enemies, which we must acknowledge too. It goes right back to Homer. Homer's Iliad, the 8th century BCE. And the Iliad, as you'll know, is the story of one incident in the 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And in the course of this war, Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, has a quarrel with his king. And in a fit of pure egotistic, childish pique, he flounces off and goes and sulks in his tent, and he withdraws all his men from the war. This is absolutely disastrous for the Greek side. There's massive confusion. And in the ensuing confusion, unfortunately, Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus is killed by Hector, who is one of the Trojan princes. And Achilles goes mad. He's normally a tender-hearted man, but he goes absolutely mad with rage and grief. And he loses his humanity. He challenges Hector to a duel, and the two of them fight it out before the two armies, and before Hector's, the royal family of Troy are watching from Hector's family are watching from the walls, city walls. And nobody can beat Achilles. And he kills Hector. And then he mutilates the body. And he ties the body to the back of his war chariot and drags it round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give the body back for burial. And that, for the Greeks, meant that Hector's soul would never know rest. It would remain forever restless, unhappy, distressed, uneasy. And it's a terrible thing to do because he won't be denied a proper burial. So one night, suddenly though, into the Greek camp comes Hector's father, old King Priam. And he's in disguise. And he comes right into enemy territory. And he makes his way to Achilles' tent. Then he takes off his disguise. And of course, everybody's absolutely shocked. Here's the king of Troy. And the old man goes and falls at Achilles' feet. He's begging for the body of his son. And he puts his arms round Achilles' knees. And he's weeping not just for Hector, but for all the other sons of his that Achilles has killed in this war. And Achilles then looks at the old man, and he remembers his own father, and he begins to weep. And the two men, the two enemies, weep together. As Homer says, Priam for his sons, and Achilles now for his father, now for Patroclus. They're weeping from the heart of their own grief, but weeping together. And then they stop weeping. And then Achilles goes and fetches Hector's body and brings it and lays it in the arms of the old man, very tenderly, because he's afraid the weight will be too much for him. And then Homer says there's a moment of numinous silence, and each looks at the other and sees the other as divine. And that, I think, is when we become most godlike, when we realize that our enemies also have pain. Thank you.
Wow. It's a very inspiring session. Thank you, Ms. Karen. Dan Bapak Ibu, kita akan masuk ke dalam acara Q&A. Kita punya waktu tidak banyak, tapi kita akan mendedikasikannya untuk 3 penanya. Ya, kita akan bagi dari sisi 1, 3 row ini ada 1, 2, 3.
Oke,
Ya.
mungkin David bisa pilih dari row yang sebelah sana.
Dan kepada yang ingin bertanya, langsung saja menuju mic yang ada di tengah.
Standing mic ya.
Ya.
Oke, dimulai dari sebelah sana ya David ya.
Ada mic yang
Persilakan.
Ya. Mic-nya bisa diantarkan. Ya, saya lihat sudah ada yang di belakang, Pak. Bisa maju, Pak?
Jadi kita mohon singkat begitu ya, padat. Supaya bisa langsung dijawab oleh...
Bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia atau bahasa Inggris, nanti akan diterjemahkan oleh Bapak. Ya,
Okay,
sebutkan
straight.
nama dan juga
Okay.
pertanyaannya, mungkin singkat ya.
Okay,
Ya.
thank you. My name is Mofa from Bogor. Just straight to the question. If the essence of religion is compassion, then why are oftentimes the message is so cryptic that it leads people to commit to violence? That's it.
Yes, very good question, and I may have to come back in a couple of years again, because my new book is about religion and violence, and what is the relationship, if any, between the two. The idea that religion is somehow something separate from ordinary life, that it's a separate activity, and you can find it to special parts of the day, and you have a special day, perhaps it's Friday or Sunday where you worship, and God forbid it gets mixed up with politics, because then it's like getting a chemical and putting it in the mixture and it goes boom. But this is a Western idea conceived in the 17th century in Europe, which says that religion is the cause of all this violence. If you actually look at the violence they're talking about, religion's there, but religion permeated everything. In Christianity, as it does in Islam. The word din does not mean religion in a special little... what is the Quran but a cry for the love of God to pervade the whole of life and to build a community. This is a political thing. All religion, state ideologies before the modern period were religious. And so this idea, what we were trying to do in the West, it's like, you wouldn't know anything about this, of course, either, but in a cocktail, you have gin, and then you have other things. And what the British were trying to do was take the gin out of the cocktail. Something that's almost impossible because religion permeates everything. Makes very little sense, I would think, for a Muslim to say that you can't have religion in politics, that somehow, and of course, politics is a very dirty business. And the state is a violent state. Because no state can afford to disband its army. And states are built on coercion to a degree. So necessarily, religion gets sucked into all that. And I think it's a good idea if religion doesn't get mixed up with state politics. I like the idea of religion, a prophet, standing and saying to the ruler, this is not the way to behave, just as they do in the Bible. That's the Shia idea. Certainly religion can be violent in that degree. But it's also the case that basically people like fighting. I have to say, especially men, it seems to me. And I think, probably that if we had the physical strength, we'd have loved it too. And I can't say that any, woman prime minister has ever been any more pacific than, a male. No, but in this book that I've been researching now for 2 or 3 years, you see this absolute love of fighting among the military class. But if you think, since the West secularized their state and pushed religion out there, so God forbid it comes anywhere near, we have had 2 major world wars, fought not for religion, but for secular nationalism. Auschwitz, the concentration camps, the Gulag, were not committed in the name of religion. They were atheistic. And similarly, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not destroyed for religion. And so in its short lifespan, secularism has been just as as violent. And also, I've forgotten the marvelous remark I was about to conclude with. But I'll think of it in a minute. But so I think certainly, insofar as religion gets mixed up in state politics, as it often does, and then gets tied into politicians' egos or territorial ambitions, then it gets polluted. But what the religions have always done is provide an alternative, to say there's another way to live. I'm thinking of the Ummah, for example, in Mecca, where you have, instead of this grasping capitalistic community, pushing the poor to one side, you have a community that shares its wealth, behaves kindly to one another. There's another way to live without this violence. And the Buddhist Sangha was very much experienced in the early days when the Buddha as an alternative to the court, the royal court. A king comes to the Buddha once and says, it's lovely coming to your monastery because here everybody's nice, they're polite to me, they listen to me, and at home, in my court, people interrupt and heckle and shout at me, and they're all wheeling and dealing. But here, this is a lovely quotation, the monks look at one another with the eyes of wild deer. And that this is another gentler way to behave. And I think what our task now is to create a vibrant alternative so that we can see, to challenge that there is another way to be human and that provides a yardstick by which people can judge the undoubted hideous violence of our time.
Iya, thank you. Kita berikan tepuk tangan untuk jawabannya. Ya, jadi mungkin, agama bukan berasal dari kekerasan ya. Kekerasan itu bukan agama gitu ya. Dari agama. Jadi lebih kepada politik. Ya.
Kita berikan kesempatan kepada yang berada di row tengah begitu ya.
Di jalur tengah sekarang ya, kita langsung ke mic-nya.
Standing mic terdekat.
Di sana atau sini, ya. Sebutkan nama dan pertanyaan langsung Pak.
My name is Maulana, I'm from Bandung. Well, I recently read the UK census result. I think it's being published about last year. And it was the declining numbers of the people embracing religion. The Christians were down, and I think it's the only Muslim was a little bit up from 3.8 to 5%. But the atheism is basically, they were growing. And interestingly, there is a census in a particular borough. It said that the number of people identified themselves as the follower of the Jedi religion, which is inspired from Star Wars movie, top of the list. So I'm not joking. This is something which is quoted official census. So I read it in the Guardian, and so it looks like people believe more in Star Wars, in the West, rather than in Jesus, peace be upon him. So, and what do you think the reason behind this skepticism, and what would you say as well to people who say religion is basically responsible for many conflicts, so probably we'd be better off without religion? Thank you.
I didn't hear all that, I'm afraid. The sound was a bit on the babbling side.
Yeah. Here in Indonesia?
So, no, sorry, it's in the UK. I mean, I'm talking about in the West.
The UK, yes. The part I did hear about this, your question, was about the secularism. And religions, can be done very stupidly and aggressively, but not at all. A lot of American thinking is very pluralistic and exciting. And when I go to the United States, I speak to an audience quite differently from the way I would speak back home. In Britain, people listen to me and say, well, this is terribly interesting, as though I were talking about some ancient tribe in the far distant past with no relevance at all. Frightfully fascinating, but the Americans have tears in their eyes. They get religion. But Europe, I think it has quite a lot to do with the horror of the 20th century in Europe. 2 world wars on our own territory. You can see World War I as it's been described as the collective suicide of Europe. A whole generation of young men were mown down for an absolutely stupid, senseless war of competing nationalisms. And that gene pool has probably never quite fully recovered. It was the most appalling, senseless carnage with the young men rushing to enlist, like lemmings going over the side. And then that leads directly into World War II, because the way the Germans were humiliated at the treaty at the end of World War I, so made Adolf Hitler a possibility. And then you have the horror of the concentration camps in which the churches were implicated, or the people who did nothing and stood by and who were afraid. It's easy to condemn. I often wonder, of course, we'd like to feel we belong to one of those intrepid people who would stand out and join them in the camps, but we never know unless we're there what we'd be like. But all this, and then Stalin, and 60 million people died in Stalin's gulag. This is slaughter on a massive scale. Now, I don't think, people asking questions, what, the classical idea of God, which I think is a very limited idea of God, but it's the one that's been in vogue, says, how could a God that is all merciful and all-powerful have allowed this? And there's a famous story where Elie Wiesel, one of the concentration camp victims, watches a child being hanged to death slowly in Auschwitz. And one of their prisoners are made to watch, and with the prisoner behind him says, where is God? Where is God now? And he says, he's there on that gibbet. God is dying. We can't think of God anymore. And I think there really has been a lack of grappling with this issue. So people have fallen away thinking religion is, it's nonsense in the face of that absolute horror. And there's not been anyone really sort of grasping this theologically and saying, how do we account for evil in a world supposedly created by a good God? What does this mean for creation? And this is a problem. It's not the end of the world, and there's lots of possibilities in monotheism, especially in Judaism, for dealing with evil is somehow from God in a most mysterious way. So I think it may be about that. That there's a sort of dearth in there. Now, I don't mind that. Theologians can have very good discussions with atheists. And in the past, leading theologians like Tillich had long correspondence with leading atheistical thinkers. And it can refine your theology. Because there's and I think, too, people in the West are repelled by a lazy, inadequate theism. People who would just say, oh, well, God, I mean, I've heard learned discussions saying, oh, well, God was there and it was all working out for the best. This doesn't fly with a lot of people. It's a bit lazy. You really need to go down and grapple with this. And I think that sort of historically, atheism, which means that has always meant the denial of a particular conception of God. And at the beginning of their careers, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all called atheists by their pagan contemporaries, not because they had no faith in the divine, but because their thinking about the divine was so different that it seemed blasphemous and disturbing. You think the prophet they're always telling him he's irreligious because he's not observing the rites. And the Christians were put to death in the Roman Empire for denying the rites. Atheism can mean, if it's a principled atheism, can mean a transition to another way of thinking about the divine. Now, there's a militant form of atheism by people such as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris in the United States and the late Christopher Hitchens, which is very aggressive. And I sort of have, they don't like me very much. And Richard Dawkins, I'm trying to explain what God is, and he says in fury when we're on a panel, Karen, of course you can see, you're a very intelligent woman. Most people are incapable of this kind of thinking, which is a great insult to the British people. So, but they are accusing, quite rightly, there's been intolerance that has to be dealt with, and cruelty in religions. We religious people can be as cruel like everybody else in the name of their faith. But they are attacking religion and religious people so aggressively that they are just as intolerant. It's another form of intolerance. And it's not at all rational, it's not Socratic. If you enter into dialogue, you have to be prepared to be changed. Not means you go over to the other side, but somehow the encounter has moved something in you. And actually, I think people are getting rather tired of them now, because I think they've overstepped the mark. But I do think perhaps sometimes, in Dawkins particularly, I see someone who's been suffered from religion. And I understand that, because for years after I left my convent, I wanted nothing to do with religion ever again. And if I saw people reading a religious book on the train or anything, I would think, oh, I'm never thinking that one day I'd be writing these kind of books that people would be reading on the train. This was not my career plan at all. Fell into all this by sheer accident. But I think he looks as though he's had some terrible thing that's happened to him, and one has to think of that. But so when you see people going away from religion, I also think the British have never been very good at it, religion. I see religion very much as a kind of art form,
it's a way of finding meaning and beauty and holiness in life, as a painting does or as music does. And it's, some nations are better at some forms of art than others. Like the Italians have beautiful painting and the Germans have their music. We don't have much music. We have wonderful literature. Our literature is superb. But we're very good at religion. I'm Irish originally, so that accounts for why my friends look at me in astonishment and dismay that I'm bothering my head with this discredited stuff and are amazed that I earn a living out of it. But I think we were never really into it. Now, the Dutch, who are also a very sort of atheistic, secular country, Holland, that tiny little country, is the second biggest market for my books after the United States. So you can't, and they understand it, you get it. They may not want to do it, but they get it, in a sense. They've been good at religion. So I think there's something of that in it too. These are complex questions. But don't forget that possibility that atheism can signify a transition to another form of faith.
Oh, okay. Bagi yang berminat, Ibu Karen ini menulis sebuah buku, tidak secara langsung, tapi sebetulnya juga untuk mengcounter pandangan-pandangan seperti Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, dan lain sebagainya. Judul bukunya The Case for God, diterjemahkan dengan judul apa? Masa Depan Tuhan. Ya. Masa Depan Tuhan itu The Case for God, ditulis oleh Ibu Karen untuk menjawab pandangan-pandangan model Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, dan lain sebagainya.
Oke.
Sekarang
Kita langsung berikan kesempatan ya
ya
pada teman-teman yang ada atau hadirin yang ada di sebelah sini.
Di depan Ibu, ya.
Betul,
ada nih.
silakan Ibu.
Langsung Ibu. Wah, bergegas sekali, ya.
Karena sayangannya banyak di belakang.
Hello.
Silakan Ibu.
Miss Karen Armstrong, my name is Intan Nugroho. Hello, Mr. Bagir. And my question is, I've been sorry for your light. Can you see me?
I like to see
Oh,
you.
okay, fine.
The light is so
I've been looking at you since morning, I mean through the internet. Oh, I love the internet. You know, I could listen to your interviews with Oprah and everybody else's. And there was this question that I want to ask you. You went to the convent because you believe in the beginning that was the right thing. And then after 7 and 8 years, I don't know what happened along the way, you went out of the convent. And then that was something happened in the convent that there was this lady telling you before she died, she had cancer or something, and you remember that one, up till now, right? That she came up to you and say, you are a good girl. And you carry on that belief that you are a good girl. Yes. Nobody said I'm a good girl, but I know I'm good. But so I believe that. Can you elaborate on belief? Yes. Because that was the only thing that I couldn't listen to your interview this morning through the internet because I had to come here. So you were going to say, I'm going to touch on belief later on.
Yes.
So please elaborate. Thank you, Ms. Armstrong.
Belief, like myth, is one of those words that has changed its meaning in English. Beleven in Middle English, medieval English, and early modern English, it meant to love, to commit yourself. If you asked a knight in Chaucer, his knight says to his lady, accept my believer, accept my loyalty, my commitment to your service. And so when they translated the Bible into English in the early 17th century, they took Jesus' word, Greek word, the New Testament is written in Greek. And Jesus is asking people to have pistis, and which means commitment, loyalty. And they translated it believer. Then before that, they translated the Greek into Latin, and they used the word for, instead of pistis, they said credo, which comes from the two words cordo, I give my heart. Now, in the late 17th century, that word believin, belief, starts to change its meaning. And it's used first in this new sense by scientists
people like Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, who discovered the solar system, he says in one of his letters, it was my hope when I began this research that I would find a way for considering people to have belief in a deity. And so belief is no longer trust and commitment, it is accepting a rather strange idea. Now, Jesus, when he's asking for faith or pistis or belief, he's not asking people to believe that he's the second person of the Trinity or the incarnate Son of God. He'd have been astonished by these ideas. But he's saying, have you got commitment? And if you read those scriptures, what he's saying is, can you follow me? Can you live rough like me? Can you give up everything you have to the poor and work with me night and day for the coming of a kingdom here on earth where rich and poor will sit together at the same table? Can you suffer with me? Can you drink of the chalice that I must suffer? Are you willing to suffer for this? Have you got absolute commitment? And so religion is not about thinking things. And what this accepting, once people started reading belief as, do you believe I'm the Son of God? Or do you believe in God? It just becomes a head trip. Now, religion is a practical form of knowledge. It's not something that you arrive at like a mathematical equation, because God is not amenable to rational thought. What we call God, it's beyond what we can think and know. But you learn by doing. It's like driving or swimming. You can't learn to drive by reading the car manual or the highway code. You've got to get into the vehicle and start to manipulate the brakes, and same with swimming. You've got to get into the water and acquire the knack of floating, and then when you've got it, you can't imagine how you could ever not do it. Perhaps a better analogy is dancing. Dancing requires, or gymnastics, it requires years and years of practice. And if you dedicate yourself to it and you have the talent, you can learn to move with an absolutely unearthly grace that is completely impossible for an untrained body. And the religions have found that if you behave in a certain way, with meditation, for example, with yoga, which is not believing anything, it's doing things with your body. If you work in the ummah for a better world and make your prayers, which is a form of yoga, I always feel, a sort of a sense of where the body teaches you the absolute abandonment of the ego that is necessary for the act of Islam, surrender. You learn these, you learn the knack, and you acquire different capacities of mind and heart. But if you're just thinking, do I believe in this neat? I mean, it makes nonsense. God can remain so opaque. And for me in my convent, to come back to your question, I was sort of praying to God, expecting some, not a vision or anything, but at least some little recognition that here I was trying to get in touch, not a word. Because I had a very immature, childish view of what God is. And then I thought, well, I don't believe in this God at all. There's no proof. But when you start behaving in a certain different way, by compassion is one of the ways. And for me, it's been my study, which is my form of prayer or meditation. I get moments of joy or wonder, ecstasis, little milliseconds. But that's practice. It's doing it that way. So we've turned commitment to doing things into a head trip, that you have to acknowledge an abstract doctrine before you can even begin to live the religious life. And then people say, I don't believe it, and it all becomes nonsensical. But I've written all about that in my book, The Case for God.
1 menit saja saya mau tambahkan. Itu di dalam Islam dikatakan wa ma khalaqtul jinna wal insa illa liya'budun. Tidak aku ciptakan jin dan manusia kecuali beribadah, untuk beribadah, ya'budun beribadah. Itu dalam penafsiran Ibn Abbas, ya'budun itu menghamba atau worship, itu diterjemahkan sebagai mengenal Tuhan. Jadi ayat itu bisa ditafsirkan wa ma khalaqtul jinna wal insa illa liya'rifun. Tidak aku ciptakan jin dan manusia kecuali untuk mengenalnya. Dan mengenal di dalam konsep Islam itu, mengenal Tuhan itu sama dengan mencintai Tuhan. Karena Tuhan mengatakan kuntu kanzan makhfiyan fa ahbabtu an urafa fa khalaqtul alam lika uraf. Aku dulu dalam waktu, bukan waktu serial, adalah perbendaharaan yang tersembunyi. Aku rindu untuk dikenali, karena itu aku ciptakan alam atau ciptaan agar aku dikenali. Jadi mengenal Tuhan itu sama dengan mencintai Tuhan. Sayangnya kita kaum muslimin ini suka diajar dengan apa yang disebut hadis Jibril. Malaikat Jibril datang kepada Nabi, dia tanya Islam itu apa, iman itu apa, tapi tidak berhenti pada iman. Dia kemudian bertanya ihsan itu apa. Harusnya menjadi seorang muslim itu tidak berhenti pada iman, tapi dia harus mencapai tahap muhsin, menjadi orang yang karena kecintaannya pada segala sesuatu menjadikan dia, apa yang dia lakukan itu menjadi kesempurnaan, keindahan yang timbul dari rasa cinta. Dan saya ingin kutip ungkapan ulama Indonesia, itu namanya Syekh Yusuf Makassari, disebut Syekh Yusuf Al-Makassari Al-Bantani, pernah di Banten. Dia meringkaskan dengan baik beberapa hadis, dia gabung jadi satu tentang agama itu apa. Dia bilang agama itu mengenal Tuhan. Mengenal Tuhan itu apa? Bahwa Tuhan itu esensinya cinta, kasih sayang. Allahu wal hub, di dalam hadis dikatakan Tuhan itu tidak lain tidak bukan adalah cinta. Jadi agama itu mencintai Tuhan. Mencintai Tuhan itu memiliki budi pekerti yang baik. Itu hadis lanjutannya. Memiliki budi pekerti yang baik itu selalu menjalin hubungan dengan manusia berdasarkan cinta. Dan memiliki hubungan berdasar cinta itu apa? Dia kutip sebuah hadis, idkhalus surur fi qalbil ikhwan, memasukkan rasa bahagia ke dalam hati sesama kita. Jadi agama itu tidak lain dan tidak bukan adalah memasukkan rasa bahagia ke dalam hati sesama. Pernah Tuhan bertanya pada Nabi Musa, Musa mana ibadahmu untukku? Musa mengatakan semua yang aku lakukan ini untukmu wahai Tuhan. Tuhan bilang enggak, itu semua kembali kepada kamu. Musa bertanya, lalu apa yang bisa aku lakukan untukmu wahai Tuhan? Tuhan mengatakan satu-satunya ibadahmu untukku adalah memasukkan rasa bahagia ke dalam diri orang yang hancur hatinya. Jadi satu-satunya ibadah kita kepada Tuhan itu adalah memasukkan rasa bahagia ke dalam diri orang yang hancur hatinya. Jadi sebetulnya di dalam esensi semua agama, beragama itu tidak lain kecuali adalah mencinta. Dan itu yang kita mau coba tampilkan dengan kehadiran Ibu Karen Armstrong.
Iya, kita berikan tepuk tangan untuk paparan dari Bapak Haidar Bagir dan Karen Armstrong. Prisi, apa kita masih punya
betul.
waktu?
David, sayang sekali kita hanya bisa memberikan kesempatan untuk 3 penanya saja pada malam hari ini. Karena saatnya kita memberikan kesempatan kepada hadirin juga untuk...
Masih siap kan?
Oh, masih siap?
Oh, masih bersedia?
Masih bisa? Panitia? Oke. Oke, ya. How many more questions that could take?
There's someone at the back there.
Okay, someone at the back, dari belakang.
Two, three
questions.
Ya. Ayo Pak, langsung masuk ke depan, ya, ke mic-nya. Mohon singkat dan padat dan jelas.
Thank you. From the early days.
Namanya Pak?
My name is Wendy.
From
Jakarta.
Okay.
Thank you very much. From the early days, we have a local wisdom, like living in harmony, ethics, etc. But all of a sudden, religion came to our countries, and then we separate each other, one follower from the other followers. So, can we conclude that we should create a syncretism so that we can get together again? Thank you very much.
Because where is religion? actually has created conflict between followers of different religion. So should we create something like syncretism?
I don't think, I myself am not, syncretism goes on anyway. We're always getting new ideas and meld our faiths and develop and change. But, you know, I believe that each faith has its own genius. And each has its own difficulties. I have been studying these religions now, and I can't see any one of them as superior to any of the others, but we don't want to lose that genius by, in some kind of conglomerate, which could be, you know, we've seen enough of conglomerates and mergers and things in the banks and industries. I think we need to preserve that genius. But these traditions are immensely complex. If I were to have to say, how would I define Christianity? There are so many different branches of it: Protestant, Catholic, Quaker, Baptist, and really very, very different. And mysticism, that's another thing that some people do, because a faith has to appeal to all the personalities and talents of the people who follow it. So it changes and develops. And it would be very difficult to say, now I'm going to merge Christianity with, it would just not work. Let's dig into that tradition and find that compassionate core, that bring that to the fore and make the compassionate voice of religion a clear and luminous and dynamic force in our polarized world. And I don't believe it's ever just religion that does it. I'll come back in 2 years perhaps when I've finished my new book.
Very good.
But
She will be back here after 2 years with her new book.
Yang pastinya Mizan Pak ya yang akan berdatang.
But, you know, the so-called wars of religion that happened in Europe, if you examine them, they're supposed to be, they're Catholics and Protestants are fighting one another to death. If you look closely, you find Catholics fighting and Protestants fighting on the same side frequently, and they're killing the other side. And the second part of the 30 Years' War is between Catholic France and Catholic Spain. This is a state-building exercise. And state building brings a lot of violence into things. Nationalism is also has its problems. One of the problems with nationalism is that from the very beginning, the first nation state was probably revolutionary France after the French Revolution. And 2 years after they declare national sovereignty and create the first secular nation state, they massacre 400,000 French people living in the west of France because they don't believe they belong to this nation. They don't like the revolution. And this has gone on. Hitler, unable to assimilate the Jewish people. Britain, unable for centuries to endure Catholics. A prime minister, Tony Blair, became a Catholic after he left the prime ministership, because the head of the British state can be a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, but he can't be a Catholic still. It's on the statute books. There was a lot of talk about how absolutely absurd that is, but still not being able to assimilate each other. Accepting of minorities has been a very great problem for the nation state. So we have great difficulty in living with one another. And to negotiate this kindly and creatively and compassionately requires a lot of discipline on our side and all the help we can get from the genius of our religion, not diluting it in any sense.
Kemarin Ibu Karen menyampaikan bahwa sampai terlalu sayang kalau orang mau meninggalkan agama atau membuat sebuah agama baru, karena sampai abad 17 tidak ada sumber bagi artistic works di dunia kecuali itu datang dari religion. dari agama, ya. Agama itu menjadi sumber artistic works, keindahan dan lain sebagainya, dan bahwa kalau sekarang terjadi konflik, maka penyebabnya bukan agama, karena seperti kata Ibu Karen tadi, kadang-kadang Catholic Prancis perang sama Catholic Spain, bukan karena perbedaan agama. Jadi yang lebih penting adalah menjaga agama yang sudah terbukti selama berabad-abad menjadi sumber keindahan, kebaikan dan lain sebagainya, dan mengembalikan posisinya dengan mengajak semua pengikut agama untuk mengutamakan compassion. Kira-kira gitu yang disampaikan.
Iya, terima kasih.
Kita
satu lagi
ya, supaya kita punya waktu banyak juga untuk tanda tangan.
Yang sebelah sini mungkin.
Betul,
ya.
silakan. Yang tengah David, ya. Yang tengah ya.
Tengah boleh?
Oke, silakan Bapak.
Silakan langsung Pak. Karena setelah ini kita akan ada signing book session ya.
I have to say that this is a very special night of my life to have met Professor Karen Armstrong. I'm very happy tonight. I'm among the chosen. This is lucky and blessed crowd. I love this charter for compassion very much. And because I love this charter for compassion, I think in the spirit of Bertrand Russell, I have to say something maybe not very sympathetic question, but I think it must be raised for the sake of this charter for compassion. One of the recurrent themes in the Quran is the seemingly everlasting contrast between the believers' few and the unbelieving masses. And that implicitly concluding that the two would never meet. Now, the compassionate would be the profession of the few, and the hateful would be the profession of the many. And that happens wherever in the entire world, wherever in the entire civilization. What is your view, Professor Karen Armstrong? Dear Karen Armstrong, what is your view of these allegedly eternal contradictions?
What?
Yeah, according to him, like in the Quran, for instance, compassion would only be
Bergaul, yeah.
Few.
Yeah.
The masses would not be having
Yeah.
this compassion. What is your view on this?
I'm not finished yet. And so let me say it slowly. What is your view of the envisage of the contradiction of the view that there is an eternal contradiction between the believing few and the unbelieving masses, between the believing few and the hateful masses?
Okay.
And the related question as such, could you envisage or imagine, could we all envisage or imagine the limit of our Charter for Compassion movement?
Thank you. I think I've got this. The sound is a bit sort of bubbly.
Memang
up
di
here.
depan sini agak kurang jelas suaranya tadi, tapi sudah tertangkap, silakan.
Okay, I'll try and do my best with what I've understood. I think certainly there is in the Quran. He talks about the Quran talks about the kafirun, the people who are jahili. This is not though about anything that they're believing. Actually, the word kufr, as you know, means ingratitude. It's like it's supposing someone gave me this glass of water very kindly and I dashed it out of their hands. And the Quran has no problem with their beliefs. In fact, the Quran says, as far as I recall, that their theology is quite correct. If you ask them, do they believe that Allah created the world, they'll say most certainly. That's perfectly correct. They're not acting on it, that's the thing. And also the word jahili means also irascible. There are some violent people around. But the idea that there is an internal gulf separating these people forever, and in fact a lot of these jahili people became Muslims after the Prophet's, in the last years of the Prophet's life, and attained very high office in the Muslim state. So the Umayyad family, for example, created the first empire, and they had been deeply against the Prophet. So I think he's talking, the Quran is talking very much to a particular situation in Mecca, but not an eternal gulf. I think you have much more of an internal gulf, I have to say, in the New Testament, where we do have people cast into outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth sometimes. But we don't know really. The New Testament's a very different scripture from the Quran, and written many years after Jesus' death, and we don't know very much of these are what the words of Jesus are. But there's more of a tension there, I think, than I've ever found in the Quran. But the mercy of God knows no measure. And if there's that lovely passage in the Quran where God says to Muhammad, if we had wished to make you all one single ummah, we would have done so. But this is not our will. Our religious diversity is part of God's will. And that people who are outside, don't expect them all to come into the ummah. This is perfectly all right. And so there has been this, and I think the Sufis too have a very strong tradition, perhaps an outstanding tradition of appreciation of other faiths. And I'd like to share with you this quotation that I found very early in my studies from Ibn Arabi, that made a great difference to me after my rather parochial Catholic upbringing. We didn't even think Protestants were on the page, let alone Jews and Muslims or Buddhists or anybody. So here's what Ibn Arabi says: do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to recognize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself, which he would not do, and consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. And I think if you take that to heart in our plural world, where for the first time in history we are able to learn about one another's faiths in depth, in a way because of linguistic barriers being broken down and travel so much easier, we are now able to see the profound faith that lies at the heart of all these traditions. And this, Ibn Arabi had got it right. Earlier this year, the Imam of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, very kindly arranged for me to speak in Washington to a luncheon group of highly conservative evangelical Christians. And one of them said to me, there's this text that the more hardline Christians always bring out, that Jesus said, no man comes to the Father but through me. So sorry, you Muslims and Jews and all the rest of it. This is so ma'am, what do you think of that? So I tried a little biblical criticism on them, because this is really only St. John's Gospel, a very sort of different form of Christianity from the Matthew, Mark, but that wasn't going down well at all. They don't really like biblical criticism, so I gave that up. And I said, now look at the Gospels.
What do the Gospels show us? But a man, Jesus, who is constantly annoying the establishment, who is constantly breaking down barriers, constantly reaching out to go to the other side, to people who are shunned by the establishment, who are regarded as sinners, having dinner with people who are considered impure by society, constantly knocking down barriers and seen as a highly dangerous, anarchic person. Would this person, if he could come back today, knowing all we know about the richness of other faiths, having this record of being extremely rebellious and knocking down barriers, would he then say, knowing what we know now, which was not possible for anybody to know 2,000 years ago, sorry, no one comes to the Father but through me? Absolute nonsense. There's one of my great heroes who's helped me a great deal in my journey is Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the Harvard professor, Canadian professor originally. And he says, and he was a minister himself, but he said, with what we know now about other faiths, it could even be blasphemous to say that one tradition has the monopoly of faith. Now, some people find this challenging because they feel, ours has got to be the best. But think of the Quran. O people, we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. A real outreach and not taking your tribe or your nation as the be-all and end-all. It's a dress rehearsal, because in the tribe and the nation, you have to rub up against people you don't like, even in that close-knit group. This is a rehearsal for the challenging encounter with the other. And I think this is one of the great gifts. I came back to religion by studying other religious traditions. And that helped me to see what my own Catholicism had been trying to do at its best. I didn't find this kind of embrace doesn't mean you have to abandon your own faith. Should keep with it if you can. But just change your outlook as to what faith and religion does to you. It's not an exclusive club. It's meant to enlarge our hearts, and our hearts need enlarging in this polarized world.
Ya, sangat dalam maknanya, dan mungkin again because of the time limit, I'm sorry, kita harus menutup. Tapi kita mau dengar satu kata summary mungkin dari Bapak.
Terima kasih. Saya tentu tidak ada waktu, saya hanya ingin menggarisbawahi apa yang disampaikan oleh Ibu Karen tadi, bahwa compassionate city itu harus menjadi uncomfortable city. Ya. Jadi seperti kata Ibu Karen tadi, pasir di dalam kerang yang menjadikan batu itu menjadi mutiara gitu. Jadi di dalam hati kita itu yang berada di kota compassionate, kita harus selalu merasa ada sesuatu yang mengganggu kita dan mendorong kita untuk berbuat. Tapi seperti pasir di dalam kerang yang menjadikan batu menjadi mutiara itu, rasa yang tidak enak di hati kita melihat kesulitan-kesulitan orang itu akan menjadikan hati kita menjadi lembut. Jadi, dan ini penting sekali untuk para penduduk Jakarta, ya, yang nafsi-nafsi, bahwa kalau Jakarta ini, dan Ibu Karen would really love to see Jakarta to become a compassionate city, ya, kemarin dikatakan begitu. Ini penduduknya, terutama yang punya kelebihan, yang privilege view ini, tidak boleh hidup tenang. Tidak boleh merasa tidak terganggu oleh kenyataan betapa banyak orang susah di Jakarta, betapa banyak orang miskin di Jakarta. Jadi syaratnya untuk menjadi a compassionate city adalah menjadi an uncomfortable city katanya. Dan ini saya kira menarik. Sebagai penutup, Nabi Muhammad itu oleh Allah disebut memiliki akhlak yang agung. Dan digambarkan oleh Allah apa? Telah datang seorang rasul dari kalanganmu sendiri manusia, terasa berat apa-apa kesulitan-kesulitan yang menimpamu. Jadi sifatnya Nabi itu apa? kesulitan orang itu dirasakan sebagai sesuatu yang berat. Dan azizun alaihi ma'anitum harisun alaikum. Selalu ingin kamu itu mendapatkan kebaikan. Ya. Jadi sifat seperti itu sampai Nabi mengatakan semua Nabi itu bebannya berat di dalam hatinya. Tapi kata Nabi tidak ada Nabi yang bebannya seberat bebanku. Itu sebabnya dia mengatakan tidak beriman seseorang kalau dia bisa tidur nyenyak sementara tetangganya kelaparan. Dan tetangga di zaman internet ini luas sekali. Saya kira itu saja yang saya sampaikan untuk.
Iya, terima kasih kepada Bapak Haidar Bagir dan semoga pemerintah kita juga merasakan juga ya, compassionate juga ya, itu yang penting Pak ya.
Oke. Kita saatnya kita untuk mendapatkan tanda tangan, kita berikan kesempatan pada hadirin yang untuk mau mendapatkan tanda tangan dari Karen.
Ya.
Tapi harus, mohon maaf harus mengantri, akan diatur oleh panitia. Tapi ada aturannya, sedikit
Betul.
aturan dalam tanda petik ya David ya.
Betul.
Hanya tanda tangan saja, tidak bisa foto bersama Karen ataupun ngobrol begitu ya. Karena memang kondisi Karen yang tidak memungkinkan untuk itu, ini juga sudah cukup larut ya David ya.
Ya, ya. Sebelum naik Pak, mohon maaf sebentar. Compassion dulu Pak ya, kita belajar compassion, jangan lewat dari nyelonong gitu, jadi dari belakang, mohon maaf ya. Kita harus belajar compassion juga kepada yang lain karena antriannya dari belakang. Dan sebagai informasi juga, besok ada kelas juga yang kita bisa saksikan bersama di Paramadina dari jam 3 sampai jam 5 di Paramadina University. Akan ada Karen Armstrong bersama Bapak Anies Baswedan yang akan hadir untuk membahas tentang buku ini. Iya, sekali lagi Bapak dan Ibu kita belajar compassion ya, jangan menyelak. Yang kami butuhkan adalah kerjasama dari belakang mulai antriannya. Dan ya kami mohon dengan sangat untuk kita compassion terhadap orang lain yang sudah mengantri dari belakang dan jangan menyelak. Dan kami mohon maaf apabila nanti di tengah-tengah misalkan Armstrong harus beristirahat. Kami mohon juga compassion dari para pengunjung sekalian untuk tidak bersungut-sungut apabila nanti antrian kami hentikan. Sekali lagi, karena begitu banyak yang ingin bukunya ditandatangan dan juga kondisi Karen yang kurang sehat, kami mohon maaf apabila nanti di tengah-tengah antrian kami akan hentikan dan bisa dilanjutkan besok mungkin di Paramadina University. Terima kasih. Dan sekali lagi kami ingatkan untuk tidak berbicara dan tidak mengambil foto ketika bukunya ditandatangani. Terima kasih. Ya, dan dengan demikian maka berakhirlah sudah Karen Armstrong to Indonesia Public Lecture Jakarta 14 Juni 2013. Saya David Manalu.
Saya Christian Humbalangki, sampai jumpa di lain kesempatan dan selamat malam.
Selamat malam. Ya, sebuah informasi tambahan kepada para hadirin yang hadir untuk meminta buku ini tanda tangan. Maksimal adalah 2 buku per orang, ya. Maksimal 2 buku per orang apabila Anda ingin buku Anda ditandatangani oleh Karen Armstrong. Ya, dikarenakan kondisi Karen yang kurang baik saat ini, maka kita harus compassionate juga kepada Karen. So only 2 books maximum per person. Ya, thank you very much. Ya, Bapak dan Ibu sambil menunggu antrian, ini ada informasi menarik. Di bawah, yaitu di lantai 10 sedang ada pameran foto-foto bertema anak-anak Indonesia dan kebinekaan untuk menggalang dana. Jadi dananya akan digunakan untuk menerbangkan 10 anak dari seluruh pelosok Indonesia agar dapat berpartisipasi dalam program Sabang Merauke. Nah, program Sabang Merauke itu adalah Armstrong dapat mengunjungi pameran foto di bawah yaitu di lantai 10. Terima kasih.
Dan juga David, besok masih ada public lecture juga di Universitas Paramadina. Jadi kalaupun nanti hadirin yang sudah mengantri dan tidak mendapatkan kesempatan mungkin bisa datang besok sekalian ikut kuliah umumnya juga di Universitas Paramadina pukul 15 mulainya.
Oke.
Jam 3 sore.
Lebih mendalami juga bagus ya. Ya, bagi Anda yang nanti ternyata dihentikan antriannya, masih ada kesempatan besok ya Frizi ya. Ya. Di Universitas Paramadina di Gatot Subroto. Ya, sebagai informasi tambahan kepada Anda yang ingin mendapatkan tanda tangan dari Karen Armstrong, kami mohon dengan sangat selain tidak berbicara dan juga berfoto, untuk mohon dengan sangat tidak meminta Karen Armstrong menuliskan nama Anda atau nama siapapun di buku yang akan ditanda.